Good evening, everyone. I hope you guys are good. I'm not so sure if you guys can hear me on the other side. Please just signal me if you can hear me so that I know what's happening.
I can hear you, man.
All right. No, thanks a lot. I'm assuming a lot of people don't have power today. That's one thing that has been challenging a lot of us, even for me right now as we speak. I'm at the library. Um, Not so sure as when the power will be back. But yeah, no, good evening, guys, and thanks a lot for pulling through. The others who get power as time goes on will just join us and get us as we are going through the session. And please also note that this session is recorded. It is live on Facebook. For those who are streaming on Facebook, it is live there. And the main topic for today, I'm sure a lot of you guys saw the poster. We are talking about what is currently happening, and what is currently happening is the Russian and the Ukraine war. There's a conflict there, and it's part of the things that are currently happening. And it is just always important and interesting to know what the fight is about. Why is the conflict happening? And when I was just trying to understand why these guys are actually fighting, um, I found a clip that whereby President Putin was just addressing the nation and the rest of the world. And part of what he said was that he said that Ukraine's bid to join NATO was a threat to Russia, and it tried to delegitimize the country as a creation of the communist rulers of the Soviet Union. Now, the NATO, which is usually present in a lot of things, and it is known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The NATO is a military alliance that has expanded to include 30 countries since it was created in 1949. Now, Ukraine was not part of this. It is not part of this NATO, and Russia has demanded that the country does not join the alliances. So, based on my understanding, I got to see that it seems like Russia was threatened, thinking that Ukraine wants to join and be part of the NATO, and of which that is not the case. But we're not too sure as to is that the case, is that not the case. That is just part of the understanding why I think these guys ended up having a conflict. But just to understand from you guys, what do you think has led to what is currently happening? What do you guys think has caused the Russian conflict? And why are these guys actually fighting in the first place?
Oui.
I'll type the question for those who didn't hear, and also for those who might join later on so that they are up to date with what is currently being discussed. But the main question right now is the why behind the conflict. What do you guys think? What do you guys think has led to the war, and what are these guys actually fighting for?
Uh, I think if I remember correctly, at some point, I think in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO and Russia had an agreement that they wouldn't expand past a certain border to so that because you do know that Russia, we do all know that Russia and the West, the so-called West, are in a geopolitical conflict. And so they had an agreement that they wouldn't expand past certain countries so that Russia would still have room to maneuver. However, as it turns out, in 1994, NATO allowed a few countries that were neighboring Russia to join the organization. And then in the early 2000s again, they did the same thing, and it's been a bone of contention with between Russia and Europe and the European Union and NATO, because as you'd find out, in most of the countries around that area, the U.S. has military bases there. And if your biggest rival has military bases close to you, while you cannot reach them, and they're all the way past the Atlantic Ocean, then it puts you in danger. And so that has been a bone of contention between them, and the U.S. and its allies haven't done much to actually acknowledge Putin's concerns and provide them with alternatives, right? Or find out other means of dealing with that situation. And then on the other hand as well, Putin, from a documentary of him that I'd watched, I think close to 10 years ago now, is that Putin has always had also the ambition of rebuilding the so-called Russian Empire, to have the countries that were part of the Soviet Union back into Russia. If you'd remember, around 2013, he had supported a secession coup in Georgia. There is a province of Georgia that has become a country. It's called Ossetia, I think. That's the French name. I don't know if I'm getting it right in English, but you'll forgive me because of that. And so he financed and supported that rebellion to the point that two provinces, I think, in Georgia declared their independences, and Russia is the only country in the world that supports them, that acknowledges actually that these people are a country. And then the same thing was happening as well in Ukraine, where a few regions neighboring with Russia were trying to declare their independency. And again, Russia also was, supporting those people because the majority of the people there do have ties with Russia. So it's a kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, we cannot say that Russia is right to invade Ukraine, and on the other also we cannot declare them as being wrong. And Ukraine, to my understanding, to a certain extent, has been caught up, in between the conflict between the U.S. and Russia.
No, thanks a lot, my man. Just started the conversation actually, and we're just trying to understand the cause behind the whole Russian and Ukraine conflict, the war that is happening, and what could be the cause to that, what has led to that. So feel free to just jump in and just share your views and your thoughts as to what do you think is happening, what do you think has led to the conflict. Feel free to just jump in. It's a conversation. No need to wait until I acknowledge. Just jump in. So, my man, I was just listening to what you were saying while you were just talking about the history of Russia and the history of Ukraine. And we were just explaining the relations that these countries had and the unions they were part of and all of that. By just you assessing what is currently happening, did you see this happening, or you never thought that such a thing would happen? I'm just giving feedback on the previous speaker and just doing a follow up on the. comments that he made?
Oh, truth be told, I've been very much disconnected from political news, so I wasn't quite aware of the depth of the situation until like early early December, I think, when I caught a glimpse of the situation, but I didn't pay it much mind. And in January as well, I was like, you know what? Surely they're going to sort the situation because Ukraine as well has been in conflict internally with the regions around Crimea and the region around Donetsk. Well, Donetsk is mostly known because of their football club. They've got like the best soccer team there in Russia, in Ukraine. And so I knew there was conflict there, but I didn't see it escalating to this extent.
And I feel like a lot of people were not aware of how intense and robust such their disagreements and the conflict that they had to such an extent that it could lead to what is currently happening. We've seen a lot of countries, a lot of organizations fighting against each other. Most of the times it's just verbally or showing different views. But
Hmm.
I think no one saw such a thing coming. Worse and worse, looking at the times that we're living in. It's 2022. I doubt anyone saw this coming.
That's correct. I think that's the case. We didn't really, at least, well, those of us that are part of the general public, didn't quite foresee the situation degenerating to this extent. And also, Russia, the current president of Ukraine, has died leaning towards the West. He's more West leaning than the previous guys because if I don't know if you are how familiar you are with it, but Joe Biden early in his presidency or in his candidacy was caught with having strange business dealings. His son Hunter had business dealings with people in Ukraine, and they were actually sharing a bank account with the father. And so the current regime in Ukraine is more West leaning. And that also, from a strategic point of view, is not favoring Russia. You know,
So in a way, it seems like Russia is wants to control as to who has relations with who, and if you've got relations with whom they are against, they cut you or they start fighting you. Just trying to understand what is currently happening and what you just mentioned.
I mean, so historically, the Soviet Union, since the fall after the Second World War and the U.S., they've always been in conflict geopolitically and with all the Cold War stuff that went on. But even though the wall of Berlin fell, there is still those allegiances, even if they're not as prominent as they were back then. And so it's not something that is peculiar to Russia alone. You have the U.S. doing it over and over again throughout the world. You'd remember that Gaddafi was murdered because he stood against the interests of the West here in Africa. And he was actually proposing that the African Union would be more united, They would be more united than just a mere fact of the noun. There would actually be an actual union with our own currency, with our own banking institutions, because
Mm.
under the sanctions of the Occident, Gaddafi actually built the Libyan economy to the point where it was rivaling those of the best countries in Europe.
Mm.
And he did that without the help of the US and the IMF and the World Bank, and he was leaning more towards the Chinese and and Russia. And so that
Mm.
did not favor the US, so they overthrew him. Or a more recurring case is in the east of the Congo, where you have a war going on with more than 15 million people dying. Because why? That the area is full of minerals, and the United States under Clinton started that conflict, and they wouldn't let it go. So, geopolitically, all those big players always have or are always trying to influence people around them. If we say Russia, then it's not just Russia; it's the U.S. doing it, orchestrating, overthrowing governments all over the place. Like they overthrew, in fact, the government that was there in Ukraine before the new guy comes in. So so it's basically everybody playing the Game of Thrones, if I may say so.
Yeah, no, I see. And with the organizations you were talking about, what now that seeing that this situation is just escalating, it seems like peace is not gonna be reached anytime soon, and things are just getting worse day by day. Russia is just attacking multiple cities across Ukraine and launching artillery strikes on airports, military bases, and just killing dozens of Ukraine soldiers. And just looking at what the US is doing, the US and other NATO allies, they have responded with economic sanctions on Russia. And I can see that there's a lot of other things that are going to follow on top of that against Russia. But what are some of the international organizations doing about this? Organizations like your European Union, your NATO itself. Things like the Organizations for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. What are these organizations doing? Things like the UN as well. I remember the UN has been highly proactive when it came to the pandemic, but right now it seems like some of these organizations that we are looking up to, they are quiet. What efforts are they doing just to try and calm the situation?
Thus far, I haven't seen anything concrete beyond the economical sanctions. And as far as the UN are involved, I've always been very disapproving of them, because if ever you get a chance to see the UN Secretary General, he has a catchphrase that you always hear him say, is that I would like to express my deep concerns. He's always expressing his concerns. He's always concerned about something, but he never does anything concrete. And the UN, and as far as I'm concerned, the UN is a businessmen's association, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so NATO doesn't have the capacity to intervene in that conflict, because Ukraine is not a member, although they are applying, they are submitting their membership, but they aren't an actual member. So at this point, there are only economical sanctions, and a military involvement poses a threat of a nuclear war with Russia. And so everybody has to be extra cautious around that, But then they are trying to supply Ukraine with some form of military aid, although indirectly, based on the relationship that each country has with them. And basically, this conflict has just, overthrown whatever world order we were living in, especially in Europe. The guys in Europe were living in, the assumption that we are civilized, and after the World War, we are going to be our relationship were going to be based on economics and on our culture. Basically, Russia has threatened that, and so it's going to be quite interesting to see how it pans out in the next 5 to 10 years.
And by the looks of things, it seems like already today, as we speak, Russia is already losing. Yes, it might not be military related, but it seems like it's slowly being isolated, and no one wants to rub shoulders with Russia. Only a few bold countries are publicly out there claiming that they are standing with Russia and they are supporting Russia. But a lot of countries, a lot of public figures, a lot of big organizations are just distancing themselves from Russia and actually supporting Ukraine. Um, and you get to see
Uh,
that it's. Uh-huh.
no, no, go ahead, go ahead. I wouldn't want to
Yeah, no,
interrupt
I
your
was
mid
just gonna
thought.
say that you get to see that already they are fighting a fight. By the looks of things, they've already lost the fight. Yes, as I was saying, that military based, they might win it, they might win the whole war and the conflict, but getting back, recovering from that, I feel like Russia is not gonna recover so easily if it's gonna recover from whatever is happening.
Uh, Economically, yes, but at the same time, it's just a display of the West's hypocrisy. Because at the same time as they are punishing Russia for for invading Ukraine, how many countries the U.S. has invaded, how many government the U.S. has overthrown.
And no one said
Just
anything about that.
no one said anything, and at the same
Mm.
time, China is effectively committing a genocide against the Muslim population, and it's been going on for the past 5 years at least. That has become
Mm.
publicly known to the media, and who
Mm.
has been saying anything? There was a team owner in the NBA, the U.S. National Basketball Association,
Mm-hmm.
that went ahead and spoke against it. It says basically called out China publicly on Twitter, and the league forced him to apologize. Or if you can remember more recently,
Mm.
John Cena apologizing to China because he called Taiwan a country, and while China thinks of Taiwan more as a province of theirs,
And
and
yet the
so
Chinese think that Africa is one country and no one
and no one is
holds them
doing it, or
accountable for that.
exactly, or while China is effectively enslaving whole countries in Africa. Just
Mm.
not so long
Mm.
ago, they claimed ownership of Uganda's national airport because the
The
country was not
Kenneth
able.
Kaunda.
Yes,
Yes, I think it
and
was a
so
year or two back, if I'm not mistaken.
it it it's not so long ago, but I
Mm.
think it's still something relevant, and
Mm-hmm.
nobody is doing it because Russia, I mean, China is where most of the West makes money culturally. You know,
Mm.
if
I
you
think
have
I think
yes,
No, no, I was just commenting on what you said. I was gonna say, I think one of the reasons why China keeps on getting away with it, it's because they do it in a much more subtle and strategic manner, and their approach. They don't come shooting and blasting bombs, but they just seize whatever you've got indirectly and without making a noise, without killing anyone, and I think that's how they've been getting away with it. And one of their reasons is that you are not paying us our money that we loaned you. Um, Now we're gonna take these assets, and then that's it. But indirectly, you get to see that these guys are pulling and they're doing exactly what Russia is doing. It's just that Russia is much more robust in their approach, and I think that's why everyone is just reacting and responding to the approach that Russia has got.
well, the the approach is also different considering certain cases. Of course, for example, in the case of Taiwan and Hong Kong, it hasn't escalated to a full-out blown military conflict. But then, when you take, for example, the case of the Uyghurs in China, where effectively they've transformed the whole province into a concentration camp, and that has been known to the media. Yet everybody is there in China for the Winter Olympics Games. So what does that tell you? Is that, for example, Hollywood the movie industry would side with China because China represents 35% of the global movie industry. So not having your movie released in China is a blow to you, to your economic performance. And so they have to cut out with them. You get the NBA who's got like a $3 billion US dollars deal with China. And so they cannot speak against China because China holds them, has a cuckold over them because of the business deals that they have, And so to me, that's just a display of hypocrisy, And
Mm.
I wouldn't call, because, and most of those people are not siding with Ukraine because they believe in what the Ukrainian people, in support the Ukrainian population, but it's because it's a good PR exercise for them. They just want to appear morally virtuous, It's virtue signaling. It's the same thing as they did with the Black Lives Matter protest. So I'm not gonna. It's been long since I stopped buying into such propaganda. Because at the same time as it's going on, researchers are publishing news about all the misgivings and the misdoings, like the so-called conspiracy theories that Joe Rogan and everyone else was talking about because of COVID, and it's just being swept under the rug because that's also where money is. And so, but not to get into a different topic, so that we shall leave for another day.
Another topic, don't worry. Now, now,
Yes.
now, 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 taking what you just mentioned, my man, and thanks a lot for the pointers that you were just touching on, as to other countries' involvement and all of that. I'd like us to look at domestically here, as the small South Africa that we are, in terms of, because also considering that South Africa is part of BRICS, right? South Africa is there, Russia is also there, and apart from these other international organizations, I wanted to just understand South Africa's approach, because I'm aware that when was it? I think it was sometime last week, whereby the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, they issued out a statement, and that statement it caused a lot of chaos within the Twitter streets and the social media, whereby South Africa was just calling Russia to withdraw from these activities immediately. I feel like the word immediately made me shake a bit. It's a strong command, more especially coming from South Africa, that you must stop immediately. It shook me a bit. Um, and I'm not so sure if maybe there's a connection here, or maybe I'm just looking at things that don't combine. But I remember recently Russia reminding South Africa about their role, the role that Russia played in the apartheid, in fighting apartheid, in assisting South Africa to fight the apartheid system. I'm not so sure what it was, that a sign that don't intervene as South Africa, because we're going to remind you guys about history. I'm not so sure about that, as to what was happening. Um, and just looking at the armed conflict that is currently happening, with no doubt that it will result in human suffering, and just the destruction and the effects will not only affect Ukraine, but the rest of the world will be affected. And it basically shows that no country will be left immune. But by just looking at the small efforts that South Africa could do as South Africa, uh, do you think we can do anything to help, maybe to try and solve the issue? Or should we just keep quiet and just blue tick the situation? Um, with what you guys have been reading and been hearing, what do you guys think should happen, or what is happening, considering the threats, the reminders that Russia is giving to South Africa about apartheid and its involvement? How do you think the approach should be? if there should be any approach, or should we just keep quiet like the rest of the other countries and just pretend and just blue tick the situation?
Ugh. So I think this is an interesting one because Tembega is quiet today, and I was looking forward to hear her opinions on this. So I'll just join you in keeping the show running until she jumps in. When I initially saw the comment about South Africa saying to Russia they should, it was Naledi Pandor that spoke, I think, first.
Yes, it was
As,
Naledi
as
Pano. She's leading the Department of International Relations.
and by the time I saw it, my friend shared a series of tweets with me, and I asked her, well, Russia should stop immediately or what? You know, there is a a cool Latin saying that I grew up hearing around me all the time. My teacher in grade 4 used to like repeating it. It said, no, service pacem para bellum. It meant that he that wants peace must be prepared for war. When you're making threats like that or you're saying things like that, you have to be able to back them up. Back in the days when Trump was still president, and they told him about Russia invading Ukraine, he said to them, "Not on my watch. You invade Ukraine, I'm gonna bomb Moscow," and Putin had to think twice. So when South Africa says that, what leverage do we actually have in that situation? What are we going to actually do beyond the expressing our deep concerns for the people of Ukraine and the human rights violation? What are we going to actually do? So yeah, I think speaking like that, making bold statements is good. It makes you, like I said earlier, make you appear morally virtuous. But are you able to actually carry out that threat? So yeah.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Hello.
I think there's nothing that South Africa can actually do to help the situation, and I feel like they made the right decision by abstaining from choosing a side in a way. Because either way, whether it works out, whether Russia wins this war or whatever happens next, somehow South Africa will be affected if it votes, whether it votes for it or against it. Um, yeah, and I think it was the best position they could have taken. Um, in terms of speaking out and the whole Naledi Pando situation, I think I think what she was saying was like the other speaker said, it was morally correct. Like she was trying to be morally correct in that sense, but not really thinking about the implications that going against Russia could have on South Africa. And by implications, I don't necessarily mean that Russia could come to South Africa next. No. Unlike the memes, that's not what I'm saying. But
Yeah, we don't know. Eh?
but I think in terms of the relations that they have, like with BRICS and all of that, I think that could affect that after this whole thing is done. And I think Russia might not consider South Africa as allies because they not necessarily are against them, but the fact that they can't necessarily take a position, which I also don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. So, yeah, I think the reason I don't necessarily have much to say is because I have more questions than I do answers or opinions. Yeah.
And interestingly enough, I think one of the reasons, apart from the relations, apart from being morally right or wrong, I think should South Africa show where their side is at, they're gonna lose tremendously from the other side. Because I was also shocked to notice that I think it was in 2020 where Russia accounted for about 7% of South Africa's citrus exports in value terms, and it accounted for about 12% of South Africa's apples and pears in the same year. So you see that the country is the second largest market when you're just looking at it in terms of trade. And 7% might sound small, but it's actually a big number in terms of when we're talking about boosting the economy. So I think it does make sense why South Africa doesn't want to be too involved or um, yeah, that's just one of the reasons I think why they choose to be a bit subtle about it.
Also, like you did mention, and Tembeka mentioned earlier on, is that both South Africa and Russia are part of the BRICS. And so the role of the BRICS was, the whole idea was to create an alternative to the US and its allies. So from that point of view, South Africa siding with the US and the European guys is going to leave them isolated, because they actually have more interest in political interest and economical geopolitical interest by aligning themselves with Russia, China, and India and Brazil. Because if you even look, actually, now that that point has been mentioned, all the BRICS guys have been somewhat neutral. All those emerging economies have been neutral in the conflict. Like, yeah, now we're not going to take any sides. We're just going to let them play out as they wish to. Turkey
Um,
could have been one of the people that supported Russia, but since they have been trying actively to join the European Union to boost also their economy, I guess that's why they had to fall back. But yeah.
just to add on to that, I also noticed that um, some, like mostly North African and Central African countries, have abstained from also voting. Um, and I'm not quite sure why that is, but like when I was just looking, I think countries that have also experienced war to a certain extent and had no type of aid, I think those countries are also abstaining from voting because I don't know what contribution it is that they could be doing, but I do think that Africa, most of Africa in a way, is just trying to sit this one out.
But it does make sense why a lot of countries are just not too conspicuous about this whole situation. Most of more especially the African countries, a lot has been happening in Africa. A lot is currently happening in Africa. A lot of wars, a lot of um, internal conflicts, be it between political parties, that actually get to affect the economy, and the rest of the world has been aware of that, but no one has been saying anything. I think it's a matter of why, when it is them, why should we involve ourselves? Yet we've been killing each other, we've been killed here, and the same guys have been quiet about it. Or actually, a lot of these guys have been part of the killings that have been happening, of course, indirectly, but they've had a lot of influence. So I think maybe that's the approach. Um, yeah, I think maybe that's the approach. that's the reason why a lot of African countries are just quiet about it and not getting involved.
I don't think that African countries are being quiet because they see it as a form of silent retaliation, you know. Because if we look into over the past 20 years, sorry, China has increasingly replaced the West, you know, as Africa's number one economic partner. And very much all those countries, because well, I'm originally from Central Africa, the Congos, Cameroon, all those people, they own China a pile of money that they cannot pay. And so when you owe someone money, you want to do their good favors, especially one that has so much control over the trade, over the financing in your country, you know. So I think it's not them trying to take some moral stand of saying like, no, why should we care for them when they do not care for us? It's more like they actually don't have anything to say. And even if they had an opinion, they have no power to back them up, anyway. So shutting up is just your best option, actually.
And the unfortunate part is that this whole conflict will affect the rest of the world, and more especially in terms of the economy. Just the world economy itself will be affected.